All right, so we're going to get started. For those who don't know me, who don't know Seed the Commons, I'm Nasim Nobari. I'm the director of Seed the Commons, which is a small grassroots organization based in San Francisco. We work towards social change through the radical transformation of our food systems. And I use the word radical not just to sound cool, but really because we want to get to the root of the problems and create genuine structural change from the root, which is a lot of what we're going to be talking about today, literally. We don't believe in sort of improving the system. We believe in changing it altogether. One of the ways that we work towards change is through public education. We've done a lot of events. We've produced a lot of kind of content for people, but we've done also workshops and these sorts of things, and often with the goal of providing people with a better understanding about the problems of the world we live in and how they relate to our food systems, and giving them the tools to become better activists, better advocates, sometimes even tools to grow their own foods. We've had gardening workshops, that sort of thing. So in October, we started a webinar series on the occasion of World Food Day, which also actually coincided with the publishing of a book, Rethinking Food and Agriculture, of which Amir Kassam, one of our speakers, is an editor. So the webinar series is Rethinking Food and Agriculture in a Time of COVID and Climate Change. And we're really trying to point out how food and agriculture really relate not only to the issues that we intuitively know they relate to, such as hunger, for example, but so many other issues, such as, for example, COVID, climate change, social inequality, and so on. So up till now, the webinars that we've done since October have been pretty largely focused on farming. The series is not going to be exclusively about farming. We're going to be addressing a lot of other aspects of our food systems, but so far it has been quite focused on farming and use of the land. But today we're going to really dig into that really deeper, into the farming aspect, the why, the how. Last week was World Soil Day, and so on that occasion, a week after that occasion, we invited two people that I think, honestly, I want to pat myself on the back. I got the best people who could have spoken for World Soil Day to talk about the importance of soil. Why is soil such a trendy topic these days? Should it be a trendy topic? Why is it so important? What does agriculture have to do with soil? How can we save our soil? And so on. So that's what today's webinar is going to be about. Both of these people are really, the experts on the farming aspect of it, and can really dig deep into the technicalities of soil and agriculture, but they're also very capable of tying all of this in with the global questions around the structure of our food system and so on. And so up until now, these webinars have attracted people some of the people that have been attending are farmers themselves. Some people are, general audience, very interested in activism. So we've really had a diversity of people attending these webinars. So I just want to let you know that it's really for everybody. So in the Q&A segment, we might get very technical questions, and we also might get questions that are not technical at all and have to do with food politics or whatever. And all of that is welcome. I'll do my best to have a balance in the questions that I transmit to the speakers. All right, so we're going to go ahead. We're going to start with a presentation by Amir Kassam, and then a presentation by Helen Atthowe. And then after the presentations, there will be a Q&A segment. For your questions, please use the Q&A window. You guys can also use the chat function, but that's more just to discuss amongst yourselves. And then feel free to use the Q&A section, and then I'll transmit the questions after the presentations. All right. So Amir Kassam is visiting professor in the School of Agriculture, Policy and Development at the University of Reading, UK, where he teaches agriculture and development. He is the moderator of the FAO-hosted Global Platform for Conservation Agriculture Community of Practice and chairman of the International Conservation Agriculture Advisory Panel for Africa. Born in Tanzania, Amir has a bachelor's in agriculture, a PhD in agroecology, and a master's in irrigation. Amir is a fellow of the Royal Society of Biology in the UK. He has published widely. In 2005, Amir was awarded an OBE in the Queen's Honours List for services to tropical agriculture and to rural development. Amir's former positions include Deputy Director General at the Africa Rice Center, CGIAR, Interim Executive Secretary of the CGIAR Science Council, and Chairman of the Aga Khan Foundation, Focus Humanitarian Assistance Europe Foundation, and Tropical Agriculture Association in the UK. All right, so we're very honored that Amir Kassam is with us today, and I'll let him go ahead. All right.
Hello, Nassim, thank you so much for having me again. I'm delighted to be with you, especially on this webinar, which is part of a global movement or an event, struggle. And I'm also delighted that this is a world webinar and a lot of people have found time to attend. I will basically look at soil management in the context of sustainability within crop farming, and I will look at two things. We don't have a lot of time. I'll go through very quickly, but then we can pick up some of the topics during the question and answer session. I will look at what the soil system looks like, and what tillage agriculture, which is essentially the dominant agriculture, does to soil and agro ecosystems within which the soil has to function in crop fields and landscapes for farmers, society, and nature. And then we will look at one of the main alternate agriculture paradigm, which is called conservation agriculture, which is essentially a no-till system, how that delivers productivity, economic, environmental, and social benefits sustainably. This is not a small topic. It's a whole new agriculture which is being promoted out there, and so, but anyway, I will try and at least introduce this topic. I would like you to keep in mind three things which to me and to my colleagues who promote conservation agriculture and the farmers who practice conservation agriculture, they have to keep three things in mind as the root causes of unsustainability in soil system and conventional and in soils which farmers operate on in conventional tillage farming. One is the mechanical tillage, and doesn't matter at what level you use tillage, it is intensive tillage. Whether you do it with a hoe or with a tractor pulling a plow, essentially these are weapons of mass destruction, which eventually destroys the soil, leading to erosion, soil degradation, destruction of soil health, and of course, with it, soil function and all the soil mediated ecosystem services and its resilience. And the outcome is land abandonment, desertification, and general dysfunctionality. Second point to keep in mind, and this is these three things are interconnected. Second thing is that not maintaining soil organic matter, preferring to work on bare soils, removal of crop biomass, and in combination of tillage, this basically leads to soil organic matter loss and soil health. This is already happening just through tillage, but then also exacerbated because the carbon turnover is not being, or carbon cycle is not being managed, and there is loss of biodiversity and all the functions which are related to biodiversity, and again, further loss of soil resilience. This, in so-called modern farming, leads to excessive mineral fertilization, of course, eventually pollution, chemical pollution, and that all contributes to further dysfunctionality. And the third aspect, which is a root cause of overall unsustainability, is poor crop diversity, tending towards monoculture, commodity thinking, in combination again with tillage and soil loss of soil health or carbon. We basically end up being vulnerable to attack by weeds, insect pests, and pathogen. And again, the outcome is a well-known phenomenon, which is excessive use of pesticides, herbicides, which again also leads to pollution and further dysfunctionality. These three things essentially are really weak in modern agriculture. In other words, we say that the modern agriculture has no ecological foundation because of these weaknesses. Soil is a living system, and it is not being seen as a living system, nor is it being treated as a living system. And soil essentially is productive capacity. Its functioning capacity is derived from several components which interact dynamically in space and time. And these are physical characteristics, hydrological characteristics, chemical, biological, and of course, all those things are affected by thermal conditions and gravitational forces, and what crops are being grown and how they are grown. And this is a very complex responsibility when we are trying to use soil for crop growth. And of course, in nature does it almost sort of, it doesn't need us to run its business. But when we intervene, we essentially start messing around and have huge negative consequences. A productive soil is a living system. Soil health and productivity depend on managing it as a complex biological system and not as a geological entity as it is commonly done. And just to give you an example, in the soil where vegetation might be growing or should be growing in crops, for example, then you have a root relationship with soil alone. If you just take that, and that zone is known as Rhizosphere, it is a busy biological bazaar with microbes and plant trading nutrients, metabolites, and exudates. A crop would push out 5 to 10 tons of carbon-rich exudates on which soil microbes and microbiomes and all the other biodiversity lives on. But these are co-evolved situations, so that the microorganisms also deliver back to the plant many benefits. And these are many benefits which we are now beginning to discover, including switching off and on gene functions and so forth, and resiliencies are involved, and many other things, taste and so forth. And that rhizosphere biodiversity is linked to the greater biodiversity in the agroecosystem. This is still very much soil related. In the soil, you have millions and millions of microorganisms, millions, and then they connect with microorganisms and mammals and other insects and on the ground surface, like frogs and lovely ladybird and of course the ground nesting birds, which are decimated with tillage, starling, wagtails, and so forth. So this complex spiders and bumblebees and everything, earthworms, and they are all there, which nature has put in the soil, and we pay absolutely, or we haven't been paying much attention until recently to any of those gifts of nature. And this is what we do, whether you are working with your muscle power or using animal traction or bigger weapons of mass destruction like harrows and plows, and even a deep reversible plow. This is what we do to our soil. And it is surprising that we haven't understood that when we do this, this is like destroying all the buildings in a city and expecting that city to function normally. And of course, as I've already mentioned, this leads to oxidation of organic matter, loss of structure, compaction, soil sealing, and loss of biological life, and then in agriculture, high energy consumption just to pull this tractor. This is a five ton equipment. Just to pull that through the soil, you will require some 40 liters of fuel per hectare, and of course other energy consumption as well. Whereas if you don't, then you start saving enormous amount of energy. But also all this leads to runoff, erosion, flooding, and so forth. So this is what we essentially do at the moment at about in the 85% of our agricultural cropland. And this has led to massive dust storms in the past, and they are still continuing. And one of the famous one is in the mid-30s in America, the Dust Bowl phase, which basically essentially destroyed the Midwest, and the dust blew all the way into the Atlantic, and covering New York and the East Coast and so forth. And you also get, because of runoff and erosion, massive erosion. This is 25 years ago, a photograph of Iguazu Falls water carrying millions of tons of topsoil. And further 1 mile away from that is the largest hydroelectric power station, Itapu Dam. And this is the overspill, and how water looked like in 25 years ago. This is at the border of Brazil, Argentina, and Paraguay. And then, of course, when you look at Great Britain, and so what I'm describing is global a disaster area, which has been created. It's a man-made disaster which we have created. And if you look at the map of Britain, this is only 5 years ago, 6 years ago. You can see sediment plumes coming out of the country from River Thames, River Severn, and this is topsoil, absolute precious topsoil going into the ocean. And when the river like Thames, for example, passes through London after a big storm, the color of the water is, as you can see here, it's brown, muddy. While the Parliament is busy talking about really important things, they are watching their billions of dollars worth of topsoil leaving the country out into the ocean, creating a dead zone, eventually basically causing vast amount of economic losses. And at the global level, we have global degradation, which has occurred now. And you can see those red and pink and yellow area. These are basically agricultural area. Wherever conventional agriculture has been practiced, we have massive degradation. And of course, we've been doing it for decades and centuries. And the book Dirt, which I would recommend all of you to read, is It has a 2,500 years of history. What we've done to our soil, our land, is by an American geomorphologist, David Montgomery. And what we found is that the UN Millennium Ecosystem Assessment in 2005 reported, it's a massive report, it took 5 years to do, that 89% of our agro-ecosystem or the ecosystem are degraded or severely degraded, and only about 10% are in reasonable shape. And over the last 70 years, we have lost 400 to 500 million hectares, about 1/3 of the land we at the moment cultivate for crops. We have lost all that land because of our so-called modern agricultural methodology. And the question therefore is, everybody's asking, and many have responded, what does sustainable soil management has to look like for crop farming? And what does it offer to farmers, society? What does it offer or has to offer to farmers and society and nature? And to me, we have to keep this in mind, that any land use for agriculture and food, if it's going to be remaining sustainable, then of course it has to be productive and profitable. There is no question about it. But then it has to deliver alongside all the ecosystem services which nature delivers free of charge to us. And if you cannot deliver those, then you are not doing something correctly. These are two things which go hand in hand, two sides of the same coin. But of course, simultaneously, we must ensure that if we're using inputs, whether they are organic or inorganic or whatever, then those inputs are used efficiently, not only because they affect profit, but of course, inputs can cause pollution. Again, doesn't matter which kinds of inputs they are, and whether energy or organic or non-organic. And then, of course, the system we have must be adequately resilient to biotic and abiotic stresses. And these days, of course, the systems have to be climate smart as well. And then in terms of, and that's the farmer, but in terms of society, we need to ensure that the fields are meeting multiple objectives at the landscape level as well. We don't want our water system polluted. We don't want erosion to take place. We don't want our streams to choke up, and we want our pollination services to continue. There are all host of things which have to be delivered at the landscape level for the community. And eventually at the national level, our river systems have to function through several watersheds before they get into the oceans. And of course, the soil has to serve as a climate change mitigator, not as a climate change global warming emitter of greenhouse gases. And of course, for flood management, this is very, very important, so we don't destroy our rural infrastructure and so forth, and always minimizing pollution so that the communities and societies are not unnecessarily bearing the brunt and the negative consequences. But also having destroyed so much of our land and knowing that our production system are very self-destructive, the sustainable system must be regenerative and rehabilitating, self-protecting and self-repairing, and otherwise it is just not going to last long enough. So switching over to this so-called sustainable solution or soil solution or land use solution, I and many others feel that these objectives which I've just described are met by the alternative crop farming system called conservation agriculture. There are other alternative approaches which have been promoted and they do their best. I am presenting this one. We can we're going to look at other systems during the question and answer session. But conservation agriculture basically has a foundation. It has a foundation which I refer to, call it as an ecological foundation of a whole set of biologically dynamic processes, and they come about because there is continuous, no or minimum mechanical soil disturbance, and this is by seeding or planting directly into untilled soil and practicing no-till weeding and making sure that other equipment and other operations are minimizing any soil disturbance. Secondly, and these are three interconnected pillars of ecological foundation. Secondly, to maintain a permanent vegetative biomass mulch cover on the soil surface. And this basically means that you are taking care of your carbon cycle or soil organic matter, but also you're taking care of soil biodiversity. All that soil biodiversity I showed you, they are like human beings. We like to eat food, and the food is biomass, and their food is biomass. And so to have a rich biodiversity related soil and fully functional, you have to make sure that the soil is fully fed with biomass, using crop biomass, cover crops, stubble. And this not only protects the soil surface, but also feeds the soil life constantly and allows it to accumulate organic matter. The third thing, which you will recall modern farming doesn't do much about, and that is to have the diversification of species, both annuals and perennials. And this is done through rotations, sequences, and associations. We can do this in a garden, in a small holding, small farm, and larger farms, and plenty of options here. So the key element is that conservation agriculture is a combination of resource conserving practices, simultaneously creating synergies between them for optimization and sustainability. And this comes about because along with this foundation, a strong foundation, other complementary good agricultural practices can be overlaid and to produce further synergies such as integrated crop, soil, nutrient, water, pest, and energy management. And conservation agriculture works in delivering productivity, economic and environmental, and even social benefits like clean water and so forth, because I've just described it's regenerative, self-repairing, and pays attention to the first thing, ecological foundation, like buildings. If you don't have a foundation in a small hut or a high riser or condominium or townhouse, you don't expect to get that house standing for too long. It pays attention to soil health and biology, plant root functions and relationship with soil life, and it enhances, at least it tries to enhance maximum amount of biodiversity above and below the ground surface. And then environmental benefits to society are also harnessed, and we basically end up with an efficient, reasonably resilient system, which is aiming at optimization and profitability. I like this picture, which shows how conservation agriculture continuously, and I'm hoping that Helen will be telling us more about it, but this is continuously is generating a spiral of enhancement and holding the land productivity and the soil productivity to the best of its potential, agroecological potential, and the farmer is doing the right things to ensure that that potential is converted into biological products of good quality, which can then be proudly sold in one's farm shop or in through local food chains and into supermarkets further afield. And if this is happening correctly on a piece of soil, on a farm, then remember every farm is connected with every other farm. And a landscape is a mosaic of land uses. And we have to make sure, if I'm a farmer, I have to be aware that I'm not alone. What I do on my farm has a consequence through what I do above the ground and below the ground, or to the landscape, and landscape as a whole, to the watershed as a whole. And this is a lovely picture from Costa Rica. Every part of that land is covered, delivering all the ecosystem services. Also, although we have altered landscape within that because we are farming, but most of those ecosystem services, if not all, are essentially being harnessed as well. Conservation agriculture is now practiced on 180 million hectares. Well, this is 5 years ago. I reckon it has been increasing over the last 10 years at the rate of 10 million hectares per year. And I reckon at the moment, my latest updating is showing that we are already at 200 million hectares. Half of it is in the developing world or low-income world, and the other half is in the industrialized world, because the issue is a global one, as Nassim was pointing out. And we have, of course, a variation in distribution at the moment, because South America, North America started ahead after that, especially after the dust storm, and Australia followed. But now we have all the other continents moving forward as fast as they can, and at the moment it is about 14% of the global cropland area is now under conservation agriculture. And the cropping system, conservation agriculture applies to all crops, all cropping system, including organic, agroforestry, or crops with trees, perennial systems, legumes, rice-based systems, wheat, even potato, mulch potato, without tillage. UK is now growing no-till potato, and so forth. Brazil has been doing it for many years, and so forth. But the ground is kept covered with biomass all the time, and you can basically apply this to any cropping system. Finally, I'm getting towards the end. Notice that I did not mention farmed animals, and I want to be open here. Like many narratives in the world, we have many myths floating around, and these narratives often are not intended to be formulated for truth-telling. They are promoting something. And the agenda might be making a profit or some sort of self-interest or whatever. And the myths which are related to farm animals is that we need farm animals for sustainability and regenerative agriculture. And they would say, and this is because manure is needed for nutrient cycling. We need this manure and grassland for carbon sequestration, and also it regenerates soil health, and also animals, unlike us, can consume waste. I want to tell you that manure is nothing more than that biomass pushed through a ruminant gut. You can leave it on the soil surface, and that will be taken in to the soil very fast by our friends known as earthworms and termites. And they will basically incorporate that biomass into the soil and produce worm cast, in fact, which is just as rich, if not richer than animal manure. Or even compost. But fine, but compost, you can compost it on the soil surface, and you can get your nutrient cycling going. So you have millions of little cows, if you want to have the cow image, in the soil already. But we have killed them. We've told them to bugger off with our tillage, destroying their habitats all the time. But they were there, put in there by nature, to do the very thing which we then say, oh, we need a big cow to do it, or goat, or so forth. Carbon sequestration, we can get all the carbon sequestration through cropping, because carbon comes from biomass. We can produce it photosynthetically, and basically, as long as we are returning the biomass back to the soil system as much as possible, it doesn't all of it have to go back, but most of it has to, so that you have to have a positive carbon balance. And then regenerative of soil health, that can be done on the cropland. You don't have to have animals and they consume waste. Nothing is wasted in nature. Absolutely nothing is wasted. And when you look at the actual story, 50 to 80% of our grain now is going into feeding livestock. In America, every person requires 1 ton of grain. You don't eat 1 ton of grain. You wouldn't be able to eat 1 ton of grain in America. But somehow your narratives on health side, on your nutrition side, and on your business side, and all the indoctrination side have told you that you must consume half a pound of meat every day, otherwise you're going to die. And this is all that nonsense which carries on, and we have this enormous burden now, carrying just to grow food, which can be used by human beings who are starving. 1 billion of them are starving and 1 billion are poor, but we feed them to the animals, and who keep land occupied in a degraded state and locked out from policy planning. And we have enormous environmental, ecological, health, and ethical impact. All that is ignored, and I'm sure we will talk more about it. So forth. So broad conclusion, regenerative agriculture does not require farm animals. CA, conservation agriculture, is a plant-based, regenerative, revolutionary paradigm at the global level. Conservation agriculture is now seen globally as a basis for truly sustainable crop agriculture, for plant-based products. It's been a farmer-driven process, as most farming has to be, but attention increasingly paid by donors, international development organizations, and we are seeing it becoming a more structural response. But that is not enough. We need the public, especially the vegan community and the movement, to demand whole food, plant-based products that are produced with conservation agriculture, including the biological and more organic versions of conservation agriculture system. There are many, many documents now available for small-scale farming, large-scale conservation agriculture farming, many books, many papers, and I run a platform for many years, and I distribute every 2 to 3 months 20 to 30 peer-reviewed papers on conservation agriculture. But there are many books. Many of them are edited by me, but latest one, which Nassim held a webinar on about a month ago, this is Rethinking Food and Agriculture, New Ways Forward. This is by me and my daughter Layla, who is an animal liberation movement activist, but also a development economist. But this book spells out the full global burden of crisis we are now carrying. Nearly all of them are man-made, interconnected, and many of them connect with our land, land management, soil management, and so forth. I think that's it. Nassim, that book has a website, and people can look at the website. I've given this here at the end, and this photograph is a farm we operate from. I'm a vice chair of a farmers association in the UK, and this farmer is Tony Reynolds, and he's showing us soil which has biopores made by earthworms, which are 1 centimeter wide. And that is the quality of the soil, which comes about when you stop mistreating it, when you leave it alone. Thank you, Nassim, for giving me so much time. And I'm sorry if I've exceeded my time limit.
Wait a second. All right, thank you so much. I already have plenty of questions for you. We'll get to them, or at least a few of them, after our next presentation. So I'm very happy that Helen is here today. Helen was actually at our very first People's Harvest Forum. The People's Harvest Forum was a conference on radical food politics that we organized for a few years in San Francisco. And Helen was one of the farmers who came to the very first one, and she brought a few cases of not only organic, I mean like her magical organic persimmons for everybody to eat. And anyway, her fruit always, has been like the best fruit and everything. So I'm very happy that she's here again. And Amir was saying like these processes are farmer driven. I think it's very important. I see sometimes events, webinars have been happening. Everyone's doing webinars obviously now, where you often have people talking about this stuff, and it's not so much a conversation of farmers, it's more a conversation of policymakers and, people in the business world and so on. And it's not that those people don't have a place, but I think that we really want to hear from the people who are on the ground. Anyway, before I read Helen's bio, I hope she doesn't get annoyed if I say this, but about a week ago, I decided I wanted to Google her because I was asking myself something. So I Googled Helen Atthowe, and I came across this forum on permaculture, a permaculture forum, and somebody had made a post about her because he had studied with her some years ago, and the title of the post was Goddess of the Soil, and that's how he described Helen Atthowe. So I thought, it was really just very well done that she happens to be with us when we're going to talk about soil, because I guess she's well recognized as, more than an expert in that area. So Helen Atthowe has spent 35 years working to connect farming, food systems, land stewardship, and conservation. She currently farms and does soil and natural enemies habitat building research on a 211-acre organic-veganic farm in Eastern Oregon. Helen and her late husband created educational videos on YouTube. It's a channel called Agrarian Dreams. We'll link it in the chat box, and did presentations about their ecological farming methods. Helen has a master's in horticulture from Rutgers University and has worked in education and research at Rutgers from 1986 to 1988, at Oregon State University 2011 to 2015, and the University of Arkansas from 84 to 85. She was a horticulture extension agent in Montana for 17 years, where she designed, taught, and wrote the manual for an organic master garden course. She also owned and operated a 30-acre certified organic vegetable fruit farm in Montana and a 26-acre certified organic orchard with her late husband in California. Helen wrote grants and conducted several on-farm research projects in Montana and California, including ecological weed and insect management, organic reduced tillage systems for vegetable and orchard crops, and managing living mulches for soil and habitat building. Helen was a board member of the Organic Farming Research Foundation from 2000 to 2005 and advisor for Wild Farm Alliance in 2018 and 2019. Thank you so much for being here. I'll let you go ahead.
Okay, let's share the screen here. Okay, can everybody see that? Good, okay. Lovely. I am going to then start. I was so excited to be listening to what we just heard. I hope you were as excited as I, because when I started this journey 40 plus years ago, we weren't talking this way. So I want to bring you along on my evolution, on my soil revolution. And this is kind of how it started. On my farm in Montana, you can see that, as Amir was talking about, there's really not any exposed bare soil. So even in the early 90s, that part, that reduced tillage, I understood. I wish that I understood then what I know now, 30 years later, but but we'll get to that. So this is the beginning, but let me tell you how I got there. Like most traditional organic farmers, I use tillage to manage weeds and water and replace nutrients from cool spring soils. And I want to say that I am going to talk exclusively about organic and ecological agriculture. Remember, Amir was talking about conservation agriculture compared to conventional agriculture. And I'm just not even going to discuss conventional agriculture. I'm going to take us, as we peel the onion further and further, deeper into what I consider sustainable agriculture. And not to be pejorative, but I'm just not even going to think about conventional agriculture. I'm going to see how far we can evolve and take this soil revolution within already what we know to be more sustainable, which is an organic system. How can we make that even more ecological? Okay. Whoops, what did I do there? Let's just move on. Okay. So the other thing that we do in traditional organic farming is that we add organic fertilizer and we till it in before planting, and then sometimes we side dress it. We make a lot of compost, and we use all kinds of other fertilizers. And in fact, that upper right-hand picture is me in the early 90s, before I could afford a bigger tractor to spread compost. I was a nitrogen monger. I'm going to discuss that quite a bit. In other words, I believed that we needed a lot of nutrients to produce the kinds of yields that I thought I needed to be sustainable. So here it is, the first farm that I started my soil revolution on in Montana in 1992. And there were some really revolutionary things that I did here. I'm going to talk about my mistakes, but I'll start by saying that you can see that the soil is covered. This is a legume living mulch. And again, I was using legumes because I still thought nitrogen was so much more important than carbon, and I needed to build up nitrogen in my soil. So you can see we have Parabinga medic up here and white clover down here, and I got to be the legume queen. But I was also learning to do reduced tillage, so the soil was covered most of the year. All right. All right. I am having a little trouble here trying to figure out how to make my presentation get bigger. Oh, and it's not doing it.
Helen?
Yeah.
So I think to make it full screen, you press on Shift and then F5.
Okay, just a sec. Shift and I don't see F5 here because let's put some glasses on. There we have it. Okay, it didn't go. Let's try this. Ah, that's what I needed to do. Okay, now I should be able to hit return that would work. Sorry about that. I'm definitely a farmer and not a technical person. So here's the beginning of trying to do conservation agriculture, trying to keep the soil covered, but still I was a closet nitrogen farmer. Okay, so in the system, when I first began in the early 1990s, I was still tilling the soil every spring. And first I would apply compost on top of that living mulch, but then I would till the whole field pretty lightly. You can see there's a lot of residue there still, but still tilling, then making beds and seeding the new clover living mulch into the row middles. Then the soil was covered by late spring or early summer. By the time we were picking broccoli and planting peppers, the soil was already unexposed and we had a growing root in the soil that was encouraging the rhizosphere, all of the microorganisms that Amir was talking about. And over time, I have to say we had very good yields, and we were known as the tomato and red pepper high quality farm, and our soil organic matter went up pretty significantly over time, even with the tillage once a year. I have a lot of data, and I'm not going to talk about it except to point out the important things that I want to. However, if anybody wants to ask more questions or have comments about any of this at the end, I'm thrilled to talk about it. So in the mid-90s, we started doing some microbial work to find out who was part of our system, because we began to realize how vital it was. Again, if I just knew then what I know now. But we found that we had pretty high total microbial biomass, and of course, it was lowest in our tilled plots and highest in our plots where we were mowing that living mulch and adding it back to the soil regularly. Just like what's done in a natural system where leaves fall to the ground and organic residues, plant residues, are added on a regular basis rather than all at once in the spring, as we tend to do with organic farming, where we add a whole bunch of residues in, we till it in, and our soil microbes feel just the way we feel after a huge dinner when we had a little bit of difficulty. So in the early 90s, all the way through the early 2000s, we were still trying to figure out how to reduce tillage more. How could we get to the point where maybe we moved to some no-till? And by 2006, we evolved to a perennial no-till clover middle. So instead of tilling the soil up every spring, we left these islands of biodiversity and microbial health, and it was a little challenging to work around all of this perennial system. And I want to say that it was hard to figure out how to use my equipment, and sometimes there was bad language as I struggled to learn how to do this. But we eventually figured out how to keep a growing root in the soil year round, to keep all those, what was that wonderful image, that millions of little cows, but I'm going to think of them not as cows, but a diversity of little animals in the soil, happy and well fed. So we were figuring out how to move from this nitrogen thinking to carbon farming, and to realize that the microbial community, that soil food web, was actually sponsoring our nutrient cycling. And that's a whole different way of thinking. So we found that we got to have microbial members of the community that we actually didn't see as much when we were doing a lot of tillage. So we started measuring mycorrhizae fungi that are usually found in more perennial systems in our annual vegetable system, with the perennial living mulches in the row middles. And again, we just continue to do the research and getting the same the same results. Took me a while to figure this out. I was a little slow. Obviously, the less tillage, the more diverse and abundant microbial community. So this is kind of a confusing slide. I'll walk us through it slowly, but in general, I just want to point out that the soil organic matter increased in this new field where we were doing perennial living mulches, but where we were also learning to not use compost, to get away from manure compost. And still, as we did that, our organic matters continue, soil organic matter levels continued to rise. So that was, now to me seems ho-hum and well, duh, Helen. But at the time, this was really important to be able to get the same yields and the same soil quality without using any manure or compost. And in fact, I realized slowly but surely that when we added manure-based compost, we actually got nitrogen and phosphorus excesses in the field, particularly in this low-till system where we were maintaining microbial health and where we were adding plant residues regularly. So this is embarrassing. I don't point this out to just many people, but after all those years in graduate school trying to figure out if organic systems could have as much nitrogen as conventional systems, I managed to have such excessive nitrate nitrogen. Amir, don't look. It's a terrible, terrible number. Fortunately, I figured out how to decrease compost so that by the early 2000s, I was driving my tractor very, very fast to only apply 1 to 2 tons per acre of compost. But still, I wasn't brave enough to really get rid of it until we moved to the new field and we did those perennial living mulches. And not surprisingly, we did not have we're still pretty darn high considering we're using plant-based system, but we did not have the really high excesses of nitrogen. And the phosphorus, I'm going to embarrassingly say, looked just as bad. So that was the main lesson from my 17 years in farming in Montana. Meanwhile, in Northern California, my husband-to-be had figured this all out far before me and had been doing carbon farming for 20 years by the time I became part of his farm, and we developed it into our farm. Carl was doing almost exactly the system that I had evolved to: no-till, the soil's covered with a perennial living mulch. There are regular surface applications of high carbon, low nitrogen plant residues throughout the growing season rather than all at once in the spring, with mowed living mulch. And we also used a wood chip compost. But there you can see the diversity, not only of our crops, but of the plants in our living mulch. And here we have a view of the rhizosphere with growing roots in the soil all year and a diversity of different kinds of root architecture and plant species. We are able to support a diverse, abundant soil food web. And in fact, with this system that was for 20 years or more applying organic plant-based residues, we saw in all 6 fields a soil organic matter increase of from 2 to 6% and wonderful crops. I will say that we were quite well known in the Bay Area for the taste of our fruit crop, and particularly our peaches. So the good news too is that the last 5 years of our farm in California, we made enough money to be able to sell that farm and semi-retire to 200 plus acres. Where, of course, the first thing we did was to see how far we could push our ecological theories. And so here we are on a new farm, 2016, a Woodley farm in Oregon. And we were developing a farm based on the principles that we had come together, where we wanted to manage ecological relationships rather than simply managing crops. So very much all of the ecological concepts that Amir was talking about in good conservation farming. And our principles are basically very similar to the one Amir was talking about, but we just came up with a few more because by golly, we're farmers and we can never keep it simple. It has to be complex. So the first one, diversify the soil food web with crop and ground cover diversity. Disturb the soil as little as possible. And we're creating then year-round safe places for not only the underground microbial soil food web, but also for beneficial insects like spiders and ground beetles that are part of our biological control. Grow a living root year round and feed that rhizosphere that Amir was talking about. Keep the soil covered with as much plant diversity as possible. And I wanted to say these are in black because these are very much the first four principles that the U.S. Soil Conservation Service, Natural Resource Conservation Service is using for their soil health program as well. And then the last five are ours. Add organic residues regularly, not all at once in the spring. See if you can keep that soil food web fed rather than asking it to do all of its work with a lot of residues added all at once. Focus on slow release carbon fertilizers rather than fast release nitrogen fertilizers. The next one is an important one, but also for social context as well and political context. We wanted to figure out how to recycle nutrients rather than to import mined nutrients from other places. So instead of bringing in rock phosphate from a mined area or lime or micronutrients, we wanted to see if we could figure out how to recycle that on our own farm. In fact, we wanted to grow all of our own fertilizer rather than to bring things from off farm from other places where we had to encourage mining or to bring in these imports. So moving on, selective fertilization, avoid fertilizing the whole field, fertilize right where the crop is, selective weeding, choose ground cover and chop and drop the weeds, use them as part of the organic residues that you're adding back to the soil to feed your soil food web, and then maintain or create wild habitat for all of the other free ecosystem service providers that Amir was talking about. Create that habitat as close to crops as possible. So there was our map. This is how we wanted to create our new farm. And you can see that picture up in the left-hand corner. It doesn't look like a regular American farm, does it? It looks pretty strange. But this is what is coming of it. So we're getting beautiful fruit crops and beautiful vegetable crops using our living mulch and hay mulch, grow our own fertilizer and not bringing in any other off-farm fertilizer, promoting nutrient cycling and recycling, and then creating soil food web habitat and above and below ground habitat for natural enemies. So here's what we've come to. Here's how we got there. So this strange system is how we did our no-till orchard. We applied hay mulch to the tree row only, and we cut this mulch from our own farm, and we applied it at about 50 pounds per tree hole. For the vegetables, and we didn't do no-till, we have a reduced tillage system, and we apply the mowed living mulch to the beds, and we also applied the hay mulch that we get from other parts of the farm as well. And this is actually an experiment that I'm not going to talk about, but I'm very excited about. This is an experiment that we're about 4 years into, seeing what we can get away with. So some of the plots have about 6 inches deep of the hay mulch from other parts of the farm. And some of the plots have only living mulch that is mowed from these centers, these row middles, into the bed, and nothing else, no other fertilizer. Now, 20 years ago, if you told me that you could produce crops by just mowing residue from a living mulch into the beds and doing strip tillage once a year, I would have said not possible. But wait till you see what the results have been. So continuing on, here's how we do the reduced tillage with the vegetables. We do 1 to 3 strip tillage passage to incorporate the mowed living mulch from the row middles and or the hay mulch. So some crops, especially when we do transplants, like tomato transplants or broccoli transplants, require less passes of the tiller, and some, like seeded crops, require a little smoother, less competitive from other vegetation seed bed. So I was going to say something else and I can't remember, so we're going to move on there. When we got to this farm, it had been ranched and it had been hayed and not much livestock. It had been hayed and they had used conventional nitrogen and phosphorus fertilizer. So we had not built up that soil organic matter framework. And in fact, when we bought the farm in late 2015, the organic matter levels were low, and those are the blue numbers here on this chart. And the nitrogen and phosphorus levels were also ridiculously low. We did not add any high nitrogen fertilizer. We only added the living mulch mowed and blown into the tree row or into the vegetable crop row, or that hay mulch I showed you. And the orchard, by the way, had none of the hay mulch. It was only the blowed living mulch from the living mulch. And in 2 years, we were able to significantly increase our soil organic matter and our nitrogen and phosphorus. But look, it's still ridiculously low. And yet we were getting 3 to 4 foot of growth on our trees. So what's working? How could we get away with this? Again, when I was in graduate school, I would have said, well, this is made up. This can't be true. It wouldn't work. But here's the continuation of this soil revolution and my evolution in thinking, fortunately, with my husband's thinking added to it. What we came to realize is that we might not have been measuring the right things when we did our soil tests. That soil fertility depends on soil microbial activity. We, of course, say that, and I had said that for 40 years as an organic farmer, but now I really get it. So here's a soil test comparison. In 2018, we went to our regular soil test, that's the A&L labs, and then we started doing the Haney soil test that is a more, I'm going to just say, a more microbially oriented soil test. And it's particularly useful for people doing reduced tillage, conservation tillage, and adding a lot of cover crops and plant residues. And still, our regular, the way we used to measure soil organic matter with the loss on ignition approach, it's still going up. We've gone from, it was a little over 2%, sometimes some of the fields right around 2%, up to over 4%. But look at the microbially active carbon, that's this gold, and the soil respiration carbon. That's all carbon measurements that are more related to the activity of the soil microbes, and they're much higher. So this is part of the story, why we can get away with the yields we're getting away with adding only what we grow on farm, only the fertilizer that we grow on farm, and with the lower levels of nutrients than we would have thought. Here's the nitrogen test. And again, the same thing. Our nitrogen levels, this is that experiment I was telling you about. And no mulch means that it was just the living mulch only blown into the tree row, into the vegetable row. And the mulch is where we added that 6 inches of mulch. And you can see where we added the 6 inches of mulch, we got a lot more nitrogen, but we were still getting good yields in the living mulch only beds, and the nitrogen was low, at least with the way we used to test the soil. But when you look at available nitrogen, which is organic nitrogen, as well as all these other forms of nitrogen, we actually had a relatively reasonable amount of nutrients for our crop. And so let's see what happened. Indeed, these are our heirloom tomatoes. I'm only growing heirlooms nowadays. And our broccoli, we were getting really very good yields with no purchased off-farm fertilizer, no labor to make and spread compost, as I had done on my farm in Montana, minimal weeding labor, and no spraying for insects and disease, all of which diminished our input costs. And I'm trying to figure that out. I'm trying to compare systems, and I haven't gotten as far as I would like. But first off, I want to just brag shamelessly. So here in this right-hand corner is a photograph of those beds that you saw with the living mulch mowed into the center and the strip tillage. And you can see that I continue to mow the living mulch and put it into the bed throughout the summer. And here we are harvesting peppers, and it was an extraordinary pepper yield this year. As good as any conventional, or I use the word conventional, that probably isn't the best word, normal, traditional organic farms, and possibly as good as some of the chemical fertilizer yields this year. So I just can't say enough about how surprised I am. Again, 10 years ago, I wouldn't have thought we could get yields like that on a system with so little inputs. But the other important thing I want to point out here is that we save a lot of labor by not using manure-based compost, hauling the manure, making the compost, and applying the compost. With this system where we're just using what we grow on farm, the labor was significantly lower. And that has brought me to some more numbers I'm trying to figure out, which is we have relatively good nutrient levels in our living mulch and in our hay mulch, at least on our farm here in Oregon. And we're finding that the hay mulch and living mulch applied directly to crops, instead of feeding it to livestock and then making compost from the manure, saves us labor, is economically sustainable, and absolutely is ecologically and environmentally sustainable. And I have a couple of other slides, but I don't know if I have time. No time. I'm going to stop right there. Thank you very much.
All right, sorry, I wasn't unmuted. Thank you so much. Yeah, that's super interesting what you were saying about it being less labor intensive. I actually my general perception was actually kind of the opposite. So that's super interesting. Thank you both so much for your presentations. Super interesting. Liz commented to Helen, when are we going to see your book? I think there's definitely great demand for that, and I hope we do see that soon. We went over the time that we had planned for the presentations, but I still want to take some time, well, both of you, so nobody needs to feel bad. I still want to take the time to get to the questions. I think I have a lot of questions. I think I'm going to just ask one or two of my own so that we can ask some of the other people's questions. Some of the questions are a little bit more I guess theoretical, and some are much more technical. So I think I'm going to do the first type first and then get to the more technical questions afterwards. For example, Bonnie, who's a veganic farmer in Oregon, she had a couple questions. She's unfortunately had to leave, but I'm still going to ask her questions and she can watch the recording later. So I have maybe a couple questions that I can do two in one. And it's more based off of what Amir was saying, but either of you can take a shot at answering. So, Amir, and also Helen, but Amir specifically, you were talking about the sustainability of certain types of farming, but I think that what a lot of people also talk about is not so much how do we maintain and improve the lands that we are farming, but rather, and avoid degrading them, but rather using agriculture to go in and really restore soils that are already degraded. And in some cases, desertified, which is the Alan Savory thing. So within that, there was something in your presentation that I thought was super interesting. You had a slide where you had a picture of someone, I think, driving a tractor, and then you also had a picture of someone with an animal, and that was, representing tillage. And so I thought it was interesting to put those pictures together. And just a couple weeks ago, I was saying something to Chama, the other co-founder of Seed the Commons, about how one of the very dominant ideologies at the moment is that within the regenerative discourse is that growing grains and legumes, growing annuals is inherently harmful, inherently degrading of the soil. And a lot of our problems as a society can be traced to the development of civilization with the growing of wheat and so on and so forth, whether we're talking about the Fertile Crescent or whether we're talking about Mesoamerica. And Chema, who comes from Mesoamerica, was saying, no, don't lump us in with the other people, because in the old world, they had draft animals. We didn't have draft animals. So anyway, I thought that was interesting, your picture with the animal alongside the tractor. So I guess, one of the questions I would have here is, can conservation agriculture and or other ecological approaches work to actually restore already degraded soils? Do you think that in that case, animals are necessary? Because what I've heard a lot is that in certain cases, we do need the animals to go and break up and actually till the soil, that once a certain level of degradation has happened, that becomes a necessary function. And I guess I'm putting a lot of questions in one, and this is for both of you, I guess. But alongside that, should we be thinking more of rewilding, or should we be thinking more of restoring ecosystems through agriculture? In Seed the Commons, we're thinking more of let's use a minimum amount of land as best we can and then free up the rest of the land for rewilding. But often we hear that rewilding is not necessarily better than bringing in a bunch of cows to restore biodiversity with them sort of helping to do that. So I guess that was sort of three questions in one. You guys don't need to answer all of them, but if you just have any thoughts on any of that. Thank you.
ahead, Amir, you start.
Okay. Thank you, Helen. Thank you, Nassim. All three very good question. Um, can we restore land? Um, uh, I think you were asking without animals. Um, of course, yes. In fact, I mean, I think you soon reach limit with animals very quickly. Um, most of our degraded land have been degraded through agriculture, first of all, including a lot of grazing land, which originally was cropland, and then it gets degraded and it gets pushed into grazing land, and it gets further degraded by livestock, and then it gets desertified. And you might say, well, no, here comes Alan Savory's technique, and we must, if you use his technique, you can restore the land. Okay, back to grazing. But remember, as soon as you do try to do that, of course, that land is basically out of your policy planning. You know, it's now dedicated to livestock. And I'm going to come to that, how badly affected United Kingdom is from that. But yes, I mean, you look at the whole of southern Brazil. The whole of southern Brazil has been restored, not through livestock, through conservation agriculture, and that that massive erosion, which I showed you, well, just one example, the river Paraná, you know, carrying tons and millions of tons of topsoil, that actually stopped. Of course, I have slides to show you how today. We've just written up a study on how that was done, that the watershed management level, you cannot restore your soil first of all without putting a brake. You need to put a brake on erosion, and what puts a brake is basically reducing the soil disturbance, and then you bring in your crops. Now, you can biologically you can start working on the soil through root systems, and this diversification of diversified root systems would do a lot of this so-called restoration. Now, of course, some soils get so degraded that you can help it. You can get going with a little bit of application of mineral nutrients if you want to, but remember the atmosphere is filled with 79% of our atmosphere is nitrogen. So you can start with your cover crop, mixed cover crop with legumes, and that they get the process going, including you can have multi-purpose cover crops, which are food crops. They are pumping in nitrogen, getting nutrient cycling going, as Helen was talking about. So yes, vast areas of land are being rehabilitated, and of course in the book one of the books I showed you, the two volume books which was published this year, has a very nice chapter by Telmo Amadou from Brazil, how the southern Brazil was rehabilitated to very high productive agriculture. Unfortunately, of course, this is all going into industrial kind of agriculture, but that's been restored through. You could only do it through conservation agriculture. You cannot restore soil mechanically. Soil health is a biological outcome, and it can only be kept healthy and productive through biological means. And we've got now some very clever, smart cover crops, and which can really biologically do the so-called biological tillage, although I don't like the term tillage. So yes, you can restore, and of course, depending on how badly you've damaged the soil, and of course, it's like a human being who might be a drug addict. it will take time to rehabilitate before that human being becomes fully functional. And same thing applies to soil systems. You can go faster, you can go slowly, but you can restore. And we've done this in the UK, out of all places. We've had to restore land here through conservation agriculture, and it is producing just as much as any other high yielding crop. The growing grain is inherently harmful. Yes, if growing any crop, it can be inherently harmful. As Helen was showing, what she was doing, she does the same crop, but totally differently now, by respecting that soil is a living organism, and we must work with it and let the soil do a lot of the work, and not us constantly thinking we must intervene. And conservation agriculture can handle all grain crops without degrading the soil. Now, of course, if you go too industrial, of course, then I would say, well, you're going to have to take care of your biodiversity and above the ground as well. But and that's another question. Rewilding an ecosystem to agriculture, whether we go well, at the moment, what 2/3 of our land is locked up by livestock production in the world. We use at the moment 1.5 billion hectares. 1.5 billion hectares for agriculture. Yeah, another double the amount, another 3 billion hectares are used for livestock. And that, as long as you keep livestock there, you remember you will keep it under degraded condition, because they're not managed properly. And if you bring in Ellen Savory, and he said he's been doing it for 40 years, fine, you will still keep it under a situation which is okay. You got some grass, you can introduce your mixed grass composition and all that, and you call it biodiversity. But the land basically is just dedicated to that particular product, and you can be in the UK now, and I'll give you an example before I hand over to Helen. In the UK, over 70% of the land is livestock. These are historical consequences of land grabbing. Yeah, and now some aren't in the world. Some people are agro-pastoralists, transhumant communities, and all that, and we fully appreciate that those have to be helped to move away from what they're doing, because they can't have a proper good quality of life by just moving. And so here in the UK, that land is locked away from policy planning. A lot of that land could be, of course, rewilded, and I think they should. But a lot of that land can go into perennial cropping, which UK is now almost devoid of, absolutely devoid of. In the UK, you got about 20,000 hectares of fruit tree orchards left. Yeah, and they're importing fruits. So many legumes and fruits and vegetables can be grown here instead of importing 80 to 90% from abroad. So a lot of that land can be used for that purpose. And some land has to be has to go back to rewilding, so that we get the watershed under better management, for flood control, for so many other things, and of course carbon sequestration. I mean, the research is showing that you can get very high carbon sequestration both in the soil as well as in the above ground biomass through properly rewilding wilded landscape, and so I don't really see. And the question is at the moment whether we go for more agro ecosystems. If you just look at the grain side, about 1.45 billion hectares we are producing. That gives us all the grain we need for human consumption, and yet we throw away 30% of that grain. 30%. If we, it's a simple calculation you could do. If you save that food, we don't need to grow any more. We don't have to intensify any further in terms of output until 2050. We don't need to, but the point is that our wastage is increasing, and we therefore say, oh, and there's this myth, and there's the narrative that we need more to intensify more and more and more and more, and everybody thinks that we need more land to 2/3 of the people are fed by ordinary small holders in this world. So even for expansion of agroecosystem, I would say, are we using the current agroecosystem efficiently? Do we need to expand? And if we need to expand, we should do integrated land use planning for society, for nature, for ecosystem services, and for massive, absolutely massive rehabilitation of this planet. And so anyway, I think I'll stop there.
I'm a very strong proponent of maintaining wild land and letting land go back to wild conditions. 3/4 of my farm is in wildland, and that supports a lot of those free ecosystem providers that help with the farm. We have birds and mammals that wander through our system and are an important part of maintaining some of the things that get out of control, like voles, like small mammals that can be quite problematic. And we have owls and raptors, and right now there are 50 turkeys, wild turkeys out in the orchard, being part of the cleanup crew and getting rid of any diseased fruit that has fallen to the ground, so that I don't have to do it. So wildlands, both practically and emotionally, because I love wild space and I think we all need it vitally for our sanity and to be good citizens, is important. Grains. Grains have been harder to do for me and the farmers I've worked with than vegetables and obviously perennial tree fruits, where you don't have to do any tillage. But they are possible to do in conservation tillage kinds of systems, and people are doing them. Different grains are easier. Remember I said transplants needed less tillage than seeded crops. Well, we can get a pretty good yield of a grain corn in our system. Not so good with some of the other grains. When I was in my 20s, I worked with, perhaps people have read the book, One Straw Revolution with Masanobu Fukuoka. And what he did with rice was a brilliant system. And we were able to succession crop different grains and get a pretty good yield. Ironically, Amir, our yields were about 30% lower with this conservation system. And so if we just got rid of the waste that you were talking about, well, there you have it. We could be a little bit lower. And then the final question was about degraded land. And I wanted to say that Woodleaf Farm in California was a scrub oak and pine clay soil hillside before Carl started farming it in the early 1980s. And he was able to regenerate that soil system. And I was able to work in one situation that really changed my thinking. It was actually mineland restoration. And it was an asbestos mine. We had to wear suits to even go out there and figure out what to do. It was so toxic. And we found some native grasses that we could get to grow about 3 inches before they died. And we kept reseeding it, and just the growing root in the soil over time we were able to finally get that toxic system to evolve back to at least a system where things could grow. So I think more research needs to be done in both the grain growing with conservation tillage and the bringing degraded land back. But I think there's certainly enough evidence to start us in the direction of doing it in a plant-based way.
Sorry, Nasim, I'd like to add, I think there's no question that conservation agriculture is doing this job, and we need to separate restoration of abandoned land from mitigating further degradation in the land we use. And this abandoned land comes out of the new land which we keep bringing in. So, for example, at the moment, now, by the way, at the moment, every year around 10 million hectares is being abandoned, and yet the UN statistics, and remember, I work for UN, does not show that. It shows that we are more or less settling down now at 1.5 billion hectares, and we're not going to expand very much for another many years to come. And and yet we are losing 10 million hectares every year. Where is it coming from? So the gross area of agricultural land is still expanding. The net area is remaining same because we are able to farm more sort of productively. So it's very important that, for example, in Europe, I had a figure which I would have shown that since 1995, yields of especially cereals have not gone up in Europe, the whole of Europe, because the soil health is very poor now, when it's difficult to maintain chemically and mechanically, and then where you don't have where you are poorly resourced, you basically, like in the low income countries, you tend to lose your land eventually, so we need to stop that, as I said, know how to put a brake on that, and that means bringing in what we call conservation agriculture. It's not conservation tillage. The tillage with conservation it's an oxymoron. Helen, I'm sorry, I don't know. It's so many ecological types of approaches are available under minimum soil disturbance, which one would use to restore land and also stop degrading further and mitigate future land degradation. I think yeah, okay.
All right, so we have about at least 15 open questions that we'll try to get to in a very short amount of time. So this is a question from Liz, who actually, I hope she doesn't mind me sharing, but she has recently studied horticulture and agroecology in a couple different places, and is planning on starting a farm on land that her family has. So I think that there are a lot of people here who are very interested because of their own projects, either ongoing projects or future projects. So this is a question from Liz to Helen. Have any non-veganic farmers been interested in your methods of farming? What kind of responses have you received from farmers who use manure and inputs that come from far away?
Boy, that's a really good question. And good for you, Liz. I mean, we need young farmers to answer some of these questions that us old people are getting too tired to answer. So that being said, I live in the middle of cattle country, and most of my rancher friends, and they are my friends generally, or good acquaintances in my community, pay attention because our yields are good. And the quality is good, but still shake their heads or laugh at me. I have a couple of what I call traditional organic people who are are moving in this direction because it makes practical sense, and they like the way our system works in terms of low inputs. I had a young man come to farm with me this summer who was interested after hearing an interview on a no-till podcast, and he left being mostly vegan and wanting to do plant-based farming, and yelling at me at the end saying, I need to do more and get it out there more. I need to get and learn things like Facebook, and there were other things. This young man was way beyond me because he was so turned on to a plant-based approach. But in general, Liz, I'd have to say that the big farmers that I still deal with, big, 100 to 200 acre organic farms I still deal with in California, are trying to deal with the tillage issue, trying to minimize their tillage. They want to use more and more cover crops. They like the living mulch idea, but they're afraid of it. It's hard to manage. A lot of them can't get past the needing animals portion. So I just quietly here in Eastern Oregon continue to do my work. And I leave it to the younger generation to help figure out this situation.
I hope it's okay for me to add a comment here. But, I was thinking about something a couple days ago. So Helen has, she's often given talks at small farmer conferences, at ecological farm conferences, agroecology conferences. I think that that's actually how I found out about her, maybe. Or in any case, before I met her, I had seen a talk that she had given at a series on our food systems that was organized by Michael Pollan, or, something along those lines here in California. So, at some point, I remember a few years ago, she was the keynote speaker at the California Small Farms Conference and so on. And our last webinar, one of our guests was Ian Tolhurst, and he recently received a Soil Farmer of the Year award. He's a longtime veganic farmer. And that was one of the questions I had for him. I said, you're so visible, you're so recognized. Does that change anything in terms of people's acceptance and adoption of veganics? But I think that at the same time, there's this incongruity, I think, often, where at the same time you have people like Helen and Ian who are very well recognized amongst their peers, and they'll even be the keynote speaker and they'll get the awards and all of these things, but they're describing what they're doing. And so people are not necessarily internalizing what they're not doing. And, oh yeah, that is a system without animals and without animal inputs, and therefore that is possible. And so the very same people might at the same time have this discourse when it comes up of course we need the manure and we need the animals. So it's not being integrated. And I was kind of thinking a couple days ago, it'd sort of be like, people who are really into fitness, bro types, who say you can't build muscle without eating animal protein, as if the same people who were saying those things were following the vegan fitness gurus on YouTube. That's kind of the same phenomenon I think we're seeing. So I guess maybe for people like me or others, it's also our job to make certain things explicit as well and put out more interviews and so on. So I think that's something that everyone can help do to build visibility in that. I mean, the visibility exists in a way, but to make certain things more explicit as well.
I wanted to say that I'm now starting to present more as I presented today. I'm getting the data together that shows what the problems were with using manure in my system. And I didn't get to the slides on biological control, but I have some really good data showing that as animals graze within orchard systems, for example, that it minimizes the biomass and the habitat, and that we are seeing less biological control organisms and less biological control and more spraying required as a result. So I'm starting to present that kind of thing. But yes, that's all I have to say.
I wonder if I should do a few of the technical questions. Oh, just before I get to them, somebody is asking Helen if these slides are available to share. So I'm wondering maybe maybe we could do a few questions and then maybe you could either share the slides. I mean, it's getting a little bit late, or we could share them later on Facebook. But yes, Mary, I think that Helen does have the slides with her, so we can share them. I think I'm going to read both of Bonnie's questions at the same time. So I think this was when Helen was speaking. Is there research that this system works? Although I don't know, actually, I don't remember. Maybe it was when Amir was speaking, so it's for either one. Is there research that this system works in a dry farming setting, that is growing when there is zero rainfall and zero irrigation while the plants mature and are completely dependent on moisture stored in the soil? So that's one of Bonnie's questions. And then the second question, Helen, how did you achieve direct seeded crops like carrots, parsnips in a no-till system? Seed drill, what was germination like?
Okay, so I've never done carrots in no-till. Remember, the system that I showed you was seeded crops in a strip tillage system. So I do still in annual crops use tillage. But what I like to say is, if you are going to use tillage, since it's such a bad thing, only be tilling something in. So I mow the living mulch in and I till that in. That also diminishes some of the weed competition. Then I mow some more living mulch in and I till that in. But I do till to diminish the competition, because particularly with my perennial living mulches, which are no longer clovers, by the way, it's just whatever was in that pasture for 50 years before I started doing it, they will move into the bed very rapidly. They will, and that's beautiful, because by the end of the year, it of course covers even the bed, but it's problematic with carrots. Darn, I should have thrown in my carrot slide this year. We had the best carrots, but those actually are one of the few crops that we have to wheel hoe and hand weed. So I hope that answers that question. And what was the other? Oh, the question was, I forgot.
Well, I'll answer that.
You go ahead.
Yeah, but this is an interesting question, because is this farming possible in dry farming where there's no rainfall and no irrigation? But could that crop mature on soil moisture? So there has to be a source for that moisture. I mean, as long as the moisture is there, vegetation would grow. Then the question is whether the moisture availability is adequate to grow the shortest growth cycle crop, which one wants to grow. And those kinds of situations are not available, that somehow miraculously water happens to be in the soil. It has to come from a source, either rainfall or precipitation, or you're bringing in that water, or a bit of both. So you're supplementing. So there's no life possible without water. Life is 70 to 80% water. You are all 70% water. Every human being and every vegetable and all our biomass, living material is mainly water. So if that is the question you were asked, and if I've understood it, that yeah, you can grow a crop if there is soil moisture, provided there is adequate supply. And by the way, Helen is we say that minimum soil disturbance, and so some of the crops are not tilled, but you have to open the space for seeds, and so many of the crops are sown through strip seeding, which often is referred to as strip tillage, but essentially it is no longer trying to sort of restructure the soil, produce so-called artificial tills, and destroy 100% of the topsoil every time you want to grow the crop. By the way, Nassim, just one that question about can we use agriculture to restore land. By the way, the nice paper I wrote with 10 authors who have been involved in this in 2013 in China. Vast areas have been restored, and you can only do it with conservation agriculture. And in Australia, we're now farming in Australia right down to 150 millimeter of rainfall per year. Same thing in Washington State. We're down to 150, 180 millimeter, and even on very steep slope, as steep as 100%. Farmers have to tie their tractors at the top on a metal peg, you know, so they don't overturn, with a rope attached to the tractor. Brazil, I mentioned to you, but Spain, vast areas of Al-Andalus area have been restored, of course, through perennial crops, orchards, vineyards, and olives. So this is and also we must remember that 3/4 of our calories at the moment come from cereals. You know, and we might want to redress that balance with more grain from legume grain. You know, and but you please do know that you can grow these crops very sustainably. You might not be able to enhance the agro-ecosystem back to close to nature, but boy, I can tell you the amount of repair we can do, and the amount of damage we're causing. For example, Europe, more than 50% of the birds are now on their way to extinction. And so when you, some of the questions are as if we're still unable to find solutions. Helen is a one classic example of learning by doing. She took a long time, but boy, she now knows her stuff and can show other people how it can be done more faster. But we are now doing it. As I said, 15% of the land area in the world now at the moment is under conservation agriculture. But when you look at what advances are taking place, for example, in America now, last statistics a couple of years ago, 52% of all agricultural land now has moved into cover cropping. Tremendous step forward. 40% of all land in American agricultural areas are under no-till now. Russia is 12 million hectares under no-till, but to get the whole thing going, you need to control the biology. You have to do what Helen does with the biomass, and you generate as much as possible. All that. So Canada, 55%, 60% of area of Canada now is under good quality conservation agriculture, and not only can you restore the land, but if you can recall that slide I showed you of Costa Rica, if you can get your landscape back to that status, as say Canada, Alberta, then you can start establishing large landscape-based provincial area or district level programs of carbon sequestration. For example, Alberta has been running a program of carbon sequestration even before Kyoto. Kyoto was the meeting where the IPCC meeting, the climate change, the regular meeting, the annual meeting, was the first time they started talking about setting targets of how much we should allow and what sort of temperature level we can consider a threshold. Before Kyoto meeting, Alberta was all under 100% conservation agriculture, and they established a carbon sequestration scheme. Now, those schemes are only possible under land use practices like you saw what Helen is doing and what I've been trying to describe to you, and I've already given you several countries where massive restoration of land, a lot of that from basically abandoned land. I mean, you know, and massive rehabilitation of functionally degraded land is now occurring through the kind of practices I've just been describing and what Helen has been doing.
I just wanted to show that dry beans work. I can't carry them all. Dry beans work very well in our system. Yeah. And with the diversity of all these different kinds, from cranberry beans to these tiger-eye beans, and they don't require as much irrigation. So I love the idea of eating less grains and going to beans.
And millions of farmers are doing what Helen is doing, even small farmers. In my life, I've worked with thousands of tiny farmers, and I mean small farmers who have got no livestock, and they're barely hanging in there, and their papers written up from Tanzania, we did more than 30,000 households in Mozambique. And you can read the papers how it was done. There's not a life animal around, but you can, and there's no inputs available either. And in some ways, thank goodness, you know, as you would say. But if you know the techniques how to revive the land productivity, and you get going, and usually most of the crops are already there, but they are not planning on a system basis, and therefore, of course, and then a lot of knowledge is missing. A lot of knowledge is there, but some is missing. And one of the main thing is, for example, carbon cycling, biomass management, and you know that's very so crucial. And I am delighted that Helen was sufficiently careful to keep data and records, you know, and so that this is she can show with numbers. But you know, I mean, biomass. Remember, biomass, dead biomass or living biomass, even dead biomass, chemical composition of biomass is the same as what a living plant requires. So when organically combined nutrients are already being managed properly, and as Helen is doing, not a molecule is leaving her farm unnecessarily. When that decomposes, it then begins to decompose at a rate and in proportion to what the plants require. And so there is hardly any loss from leaching or volatilization, and you're basically getting, you say, gosh, I'm now getting to optimum levels of conservation as well as productivity. And you have to, and you will never be told this in your classes, but those who are interested in agriculture, remember that we have exceeded our planetary boundaries. With nitrogen, we've exceeded it. We're saturated with nitrogen, mineral nitrogen. And what are we doing? 79% of our atmosphere is free nitrogen available. Why don't we start researching and harvesting that easily, free of charge? And so we got a massive job here, but so we can basically, and if I tell you that these now I don't want to be taken wrongly, because Nassim has warned us already, we need the private sector. I mean, I love the agribusiness sector, but the corporate, international, unaccountable corporate sector is essentially now at a dangerous level. They need to be now put under boundaries, because there's no way we can just continue to run a food and agriculture regime, corporate regime, in which consumers have no say in it, farmers have no say in it, the society has very little effective say in it. And we have now, that system gives you, in the UK, a 26% fertilizer use efficiency. Did you hear me? 26%. Now on Helen's farm, if she did a full life cycle analysis of her nutrients, she's going to find she's probably somewhere in the 90s. Why do we accept this nonsense? Because our narratives don't inform us, even in the highest levels of education institutions. They don't tell you the truth. That 10 million hectares have been going down the bloody drain since World War II. Yeah. Secondly, how much rainfall are we able to use nowadays? Most soils in the UK and all the intensively cultivated soil are sealed. And I would have shown you a picture there. We have created triple seals in our soils, so-called through modern farming. Yeah. And how much water gets in? 10%, 20%. As soon as there is more than an inch rainfall, it starts flooding. And then if it gets in the soil, there is no pore space for that molecule to be accommodated. Now in Helen's soil, 50% of her soil is porous. And half of that will hold water very nicely and keep the whole biology going. Now, supposing if we are able to get our infiltration rates. Now, you know, if you go to and I will stop here, a hedgerow, then the infiltration rate of water into the soil would be around 500 to 1,000 millimeter per hour. You walk 10 meters into the cultivated soil in an industrialized country, and you won't be able to push more than 20 millimeter per hour into that soil. And no wonder, in the UK, if it rains 2 inches, we are totally flooded with roads breaking and avalanches and bridges, you know, breaking. I mean, this is what we've done. And the watershed is under management by 10 different private sector companies. They can't do any planning together. Yeah. So
I think we're going to move on to the next questions because I realize we've already been here more than 2 hours now.
Well, I hopefully they're enjoying it. Yes.
Yeah, no, I mean, the question of the flooding was, you know, the narrative that I often hear is that for the, you know, the lands, the soil that's already sealed, you know, the animals are necessary for that breaking up of it. So I think it's great to hear, you know, examples where that's not the case. We've already been here more than 2 hours. A lot of the questions I think we're not going to be able to get to. And on top of that, you know, I would have really liked to be able to speak more on the level of policy and other ways of pushing these solutions and what are the impediments. But I think that's going to be for a part 2. Do you have time for a couple more questions from the speakers? Is there? Okay. So this is a question from Fireweed. Helen, I don't know if you're already acquaintances. She's a veganic farmer in British Columbia. So she says, I'm wondering if Helen could tell us what green manures she grows in between her rows, as shown near the end of her presentation, and has used as mulch. And are these self-sustaining on the farm, or is it still necessary to import green manure seed?
Hi, Fireweed. Thank you for those questions. So for the first 15 years, I did reseed every year. The beautiful thing about stepping back and not doing as much is that I don't reseed at all anymore. It seeds itself. And depending on when I mow the living mulch, what I let go to seed will tell me, and then remember that I'm letting something go to seed and then I'm mowing it and blowing it into my bed. So what I tend to do is wait till the red clover seed is in my living mulch, and then I mow that and blow it into the row, and then I get free red clover seeded. But I also get whatever else is in that living mulch. And in between my rows, that living mulch is pasture that was on this farm for 50, 60 years before we got here. So it's grasses, clovers, alfalfa, and thank God we don't have to bring them in. The weeds come for free and provide diversity. Did I answer that question enough?
Liz, who I introduced earlier, she actually had a couple questions also from the beginning of the presentation. So I'm going to read both of them at the same time. This message is for Helen Atthowe. I grow herbs and vegetables in fabric pots on my patio where they get lots of sun. I also compost my food scraps. Can you recommend an all-purpose veganic homemade fertilizer for my plants? I hear about molasses compost brews and fermented bananas and Epsom salts. I'm not sure what is credible information on the internet. What do you recommend? And her other question is, what is your ratio of carbon to nitrogen? Wait, what is your ratio of carbon to nitrogen do you add to the soil?
Boy, that's a great question that I need to calculate a little bit better. At this point, it's a higher carbon ratio because we are doing mainly grasses. There's clovers and alfalfa in the hay mulch and the living mulch, but I would say that 60% of it is grasses. So it depends, of course, whether we apply them green or we apply them in a more drier, higher carbon basis. But generally, I'm going to say it's higher carbon, but that's a good question that I should find the answer to, and I will get on it. Okay, so that was called fertilizer. Yes. So I'm glad you asked that question because once in a while, especially when I guess I should have said that for some crops, we don't till every year. We just have the mulch down and we plant right into the mulch. Once in a while, particularly in that situation, but even sometimes in where we add a lot of residue and the quality of the residue is more of a higher carbon than, higher nitrogen, we will get nutrient immobilization in early spring soils where they're a little cool, where the soil microbes are not as active and not cycling the nutrients. And so I will start to see some nutrient deficiency signs on my early crops, and I jump on it immediately. And I get my 30-gallon garbage cans out and I make a mix with alfalfa meal and molasses, mainly alfalfa meal and molasses and other things depending on what I feel like adding. And I let it ferment for a couple of days to a week, and then I root feed. So a fertilizer mix for patio, I'm for 20 years now have been using alfalfa meal for my greenhouse transplants and get beautiful plants. Is that good enough? And the recipe is going to be in the book.
Okay, so I interpret that as a promise that a book is coming. So we all have something to look forward to. There's a really good question, but I think it's a really broad question. Yeah, let me start with this one. I think this is a question that both of you have already answered through the examples that you've given. But I think that it might be nice to hear just, sort of a yes or a no to seal in that information. Lots of farmland in the global south is being mined for extractive minerals like lithium for renewables. Soil is being destroyed and water tables collapsing. Can this land now like a tar pit, can this land that is now like a tar pit be regenerated?
Go ahead, Amir.
Yes. Sorry, this is in the south where because of lack of resources, or overuse of well, first of all, nutrient exhaustion. Often we can get that going again, and in some cases we might have to supplement, but essentially you can get nutrient cycling going by having deeper rooted legumes, for example. We have got several crops which are multiple crops, so they're also food crops like pigeon pea, dolichos lablab, and they go mucuna, they go down to 1 meter or more, and they get the nutrient pump going, and you can begin to restore those while productivity can also be had, instead of next stage being abandoning the land. Water, conservation agriculture essentially uses 40% less water because there's hardly any soil evaporation, and so most of the evapotranspiration loss is transpiration loss, and so you really do conserve or minimize water requirement, and of course at the watershed level. I mean, if you're overusing the land, then the water resource, then you have to basically then begin to plan a sustainable water resource management, and in many cases that then has to put limits to drawdown, and that's what happens, say, in some of the northern countries. Then you get water quotas. At the moment, you can, I mean, like in Punjab, water is free, energy is free if you're a farmer. You don't pay any taxes on those use, and so of course eventually drawdown leads to water table going down and down and down, and then, but yeah, so but you can restore those from not just on what you do on the farm, but also then land and water use planning, and cropping system planning, and that's what we've done in many areas in Africa, and we've written up some of the cases as well.
I think what we might do is ask Amir to email us some of his papers, and then we'll post them on our Facebook page so that people can read more about these topics over the next coming days. I'm just going to do 2 more questions, and I'll ask the speakers to answer them quickly. And then, this webinar has attracted a lot of questions. What I would encourage people to do is to continue the conversation on our Facebook page. I know that a lot of the people in the audience also have a lot of knowledge on this. So if Amir and Helen are on Facebook and feel like it, of course, they can also participate. Helen says no, but I know that there are other people who also could provide some answers. So I would encourage, whatever questions haven't been answered, just continue the conversation on Facebook, and hopefully you'll attract some other experts to come in. So just 2 more. Helen, what do you do with your harvested tomato plants? Do you leave the roots in the soil? Do you leave the roots of other annual plants in the soil?
Everything stays in the soil. Everything. Nothing gets removed.
All right, and so for the last question, this is from Yvonne. I'm going to say I haven't exactly heard the same thing that she's saying. So I'll first read her question. Animal-based regenerative agriculture advocates say the cows, sheep, goats are needed because they eat the grass in areas which cannot be farmed for crops. What would you say to them? Is there any scientific study on this one that one could give to them? I would say that, I mean, I've been around a lot of people who speak in favor of animal agriculture in different contexts. And I haven't really heard exactly that argument in respect to regenerative agriculture specifically, when we're talking about regenerative, as in like what people are talking about these days of carbon sequestration and so on. What I've often heard in terms of we should have the cows and the goats and the sheep because they eat the grass in areas where we couldn't grow crops is more a general argument around sustainability, where people say, well, for example, in the UK, I've heard people make that argument where they say, well, it's better for us to have cows here because there are areas where we couldn't grow crops for humans, but on the other hand, we can have cows, they eat the grass, and then they can produce food for humans, and the alternative would be that we would be importing food. Or there are other regions in the world, let's say Central Asia or, places like that, where they're exactly making that argument. But I haven't so much heard it specifically in terms of they need to eat the grass in those areas because the crops don't grow. But I think that that's an interesting thing as well, because in California, where I am, there is a similar argument where they say we need the cows to eat the non-native grasses just to, for ecosystem management. So that's a little bit different. So anyway, so I just wanted to say, I feel like people make slightly different arguments depending on the specific topic. And so this one is something that I've heard, but not in a regenerative context, more in terms of it's better to use these cows here because we can't grow crops. And so it's better than importing crops. Anyway, so those were just some thoughts, because I feel like there's a lot of different arguments that I think often the general public sort of internalizes them, but without certain specifics, and certain things kind of become like these sort of taken as truths, but disconnected from the original argument or the original context that it was said in. Anyway, so I don't know if either of you have.
Yeah, Nassima. I mean, that again is part of this so-called narrative, and again, I would personally like to see the particular area where they say that only I can only send a goat or a cow to eat that, and nobody. No, I think that the question is, why do you want to keep the livestock in the first place, and if you have that land already, I mean, if grass is growing, you can bet a perennial tree would be able to grow, or perennial bush would be able to grow there, and you can go into rewilding. But you can see some of the aerial photograph now coming through, where areas have been locked away for military purposes, and next to it are these kinds of so-called areas where you only can use it with livestock. Well, the area next to it, which is under no go areas, I mean, they are flourishing. They're just completely, all kinds of biodiversity is there. They've got vegetation, original. Well, it would be secondary vegetation, but it recovers. Now the question is, you can use these land for other reasons, and get back to a situation where you got flood control going, infiltration management is taking place, and yeah. So, but if you if you want to keep, if you happen to have that land, I think that moving forward, you will find that a lot of that land is going to come under scrutiny, because we're going to start rewilding more and more, and we're going to go for areas which are regarded as marginal agricultural areas, and those will be, hopefully, that we can start planning at the society level, the certain areas where this argument is put forward, that these farmers will be compensated, or say, look, if you like set-aside schemes at the moment in Europe. I mean, it's because we want to put land aside for biodiversity recovery, birds and butterflies and all that. So I think we're now basically reaching a point where we know that livestock products are going to become limited, whether government does anything or not. Society, human beings, consumers are basically reacting to it. So demand is going to fall. So but if a farmer says, "Oh, I can send a cow over there," and he's going to be thinking twice. Do I have a better value here? What is my opportunity cost? Is the government going to be saying to you, "Look, you now got 5 choices. You can participate in our water management program, yeah, and make sure that you are now managing the land over there for water harvesting and water capture, or you can go in for carbon capture. We've got rewilding scheme here with certain types of trees and natural vegetation, which is sequestering. We need that now to stop erosion and to stop and to get carbon to meet our national carbon sequestration targets. Or we can go into now conservation areas, for example. We want now more and more conservation ecosystem services. So there are more and more choices becoming more apparent now, and data is coming through that the opportunity cost of some of these areas to be put under livestock is very high, So yeah, but these are petty arguments to me at the moment. You can run along with it because we are flooded with livestock products, and nobody minds. If you but now I think it's gonna be difficult to make those arguments. You can put some fruit trees, and grow orchards. And I mean, look at some of the orchards in Italy, where I spent a lot of time. I mean, these orchards. I mean, they're on very steep hills, and but they're producing vast amount of fruits and vegetables, and they send 20% of it here into the UK. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I just want to touch that briefly, that yes, our orchard in California was on very, very steep land, and it took us a while to build the soil, or it took Carl a while to build the soil. It was built when I got there, but it was definitely doable. The hillside I have out here in Eastern Oregon is what we call a high plains desert. Carl looked at it and said, "Oh, we can plant trees there." And fortunately, we kept to our irrigated land and our flat land. But if we had to, we could have done something there. It seems to me that we do need policies where we encourage people to do rewilding, because it is good for all of us on many practical levels, including food producing levels, to have free ecosystem providers available, but also for our mental and spiritual health as well. I think we need to, obviously look at land that is best for agriculture and make sure that that is maintained well, and certainly not have housing put on it. There is going to be, growing up in Montana and now here in Eastern Oregon, I, as a strong animal-free farmer, still will say there probably is some land that if really you want it to eat meat, that is maybe best for livestock. But if we can feed ourselves in other ways, then we don't necessarily need that. And do I need to show my all I'm going to
Yeah.
All right, so this is our longest.
Just one. I forgot to mention, that some of this planning is coming in. I know we have mixed feelings about what's happening in Brazil, for example, but under Lula, I mean, a lot of things happen. He, of course, created a second Ministry of Agriculture for resource poor farmers, so that they are not going to be marginalized and creating problems for elsewhere, or for themselves, or for society as a whole. And they were the programs there are integrated. I mean, the case study we've written up recently for FAO shows shows how this helps to create agricultural communities where small and large farmers are working together. And but he also brought in another thing, and that is that initially it was a bit of a hammer hitting the nail, but they brought in the 20% of farm area must now go back to perennial crops. You know, and then of course they realized that that standard rule may hurt small holders more than the large holders, and then they began to modify that. But now in Brazil you will find that they're already promoting say a land use planning which has got sort of a public a societal angle to it, and so these are going to come slowly, but and also the large big program, Basocarbon program, which was a 10-year program, was only possible because of conservation agriculture in Brazil. And they also said we want 5 million hectares of farmland now under legume in the cropping system, no question asked, you know, period. And you find that they achieve it over 10 years, and so you got now, you know, cropping system enriched with food legume crops, which are multi-purpose as well. So the pumping in nitrogen, running the nutrient cycle, enriching the soil, reducing fertilizer requirement, and infiltrating water and reducing erosion. So I'm sorry, I
No, this is, yeah.
the possibilities are so enormous. I mean, as we see what Helen has done, and this can be done, you know, and it is being done, and this is it. And listen, you started asking a question, but it's so important because it is at the root of our ignorance that our education system also began to go haywire, and it is totally in disarray. And it went side by side while the corporate sector took off this land use in one direction. The education got decoupled from the real world, and we're teaching and we're generating students. And I'm a professor at university, and I've been teaching for 20 years, and I know what kind of students I'm teaching, and these are postgraduate students, and they come and some of them say, we've done agriculture and I did not know anything about earthworms. Well, I mean, if you don't know anything about earthworms, you don't know anything about soil biodiversity, and you don't know anything about connections of that soil biodiversity to the rest of the world and rest of the biodiversity. And so we're producing people who can then go into corporate sector to be retrained, indoctrinated, and basically they are basically subjugated and do what they have to do between 9 to 5, and that's it, you know, because they've got to live as well. So we've got a rotten, I'm sorry, I mean I'm just talking generally, but of course there is silver lining. I mean, you look at Pennsylvania, you could look at Cornell, you can look at some departments in Davis, well, you know, Alberta, they all now got agroecology. Michigan has a big agroecology program. I mean, so we're getting there, but this is and I think we shouldn't even expect overnight changes, because it's a process based. But the point is that, are we doing enough already in the education system to bring all this knowledge which is now available to be given to the next generation? And the next generation starts every day. New people come every day into our education system, and the system, it remains ignorant because it's also been captured. A lot of it is captured by the corporate sector, where the money comes in from, and so it's we now have to speak more loudly about what we think, what we see the damage, what we think are the root causes, and get the debate going, and so that the other side is listening, that while we appreciate what private sector does, but we don't no longer appreciate the destruction which is created to our health, to our planet, and to in fact to our ethical well-being.
Yeah, those are really important points to leave with. And I think we'll definitely need to do a part 2 where we speak more about the structural problems, what's driving at that level, the destruction of our soil, and what changes are needed at that level. And also how individual people who might not already be plugged into the FAO and the big nonprofit system and so on, what they can actually do to make those changes happen. So I think those are all questions that we'll definitely need to address in a future webinar. And then there are other questions that I also wanted to get to, such as explore more the connections between not only soil and the earth's health, but human health and so on. So we'll definitely have to come back to this. There were quite a few questions that people had that we didn't get to answer, unfortunately. So I encourage you to continue the conversation on Facebook. Helen Atthowe also has a couple websites, her personal website and her farm's website. So we'll link to those. And so you'll probably be able to find a lot of good information there. And then Amir will also send me some articles that we can share. And I also wanted to ask people to support this webinar series by making a donation. We just put the link to our donation page in the chat box, so check that out. Yeah, so I thank you both so much. I don't know if you just have like a last comment you want to make, but we're going to be closing now because we've been here a long time and I want people to get to their weekends.
Thank you for making this possible. I learned a lot and enjoyed it.
Thank you from me. Thank you from me as well for your time and for your goodwill. Thank you so much. I learned a lot as well. Yes.
Thank you so much to both. And yeah, we'll see you all on social media soon or in a future webinar. Thank you so much.